Good. Well, welcome to the Real Zero podcast. My name's Hugh Montgomery, and I'm on my own today because Dan has some family health issues to deal with, and so we wish him and his family well. I'm very lucky, though, to have with me a terrific guest, actually, to deal with some aspects of finance that we've not spoken of before. So that is Nick. Nick, let me let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Hugh, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So my name is Nick Stoop, and I've worked in the asset management industry for most of my career. And during that time, I became very passionate about an area of asset management called positive impact investing. And 3 years ago, I set up Pangea, and we're a business that focuses on sustainable pensions and solutions with regard to that space.
Thank you, Nick. We always ask our guests the same question, first of all, so we all know we're on the same page or on different pages. Climate change is a major threat, I believe, to human health and survival. I guess, would you agree with that? And if so, how long do you think it is before we start seeing human civilization getting impacts, and how long then perhaps before civilization really is crumbling around us?
Yes, so I would absolutely agree that it's a real threat, and that's true today. I feel, with the benefit of hindsight, that's probably been true for the last 20 or so years, and certainly there are populations, communities around this planet that have already been suffering and struggling with the impacts of climate change. In terms of broader societal collapse, I think that's very difficult to put a time frame on. I think we're in a position where clearly we need to be doing as much as we possibly can to mitigate a worsening situation globally. I fear at the moment, from a geopolitical perspective, you've got a climate that is worsening globally, but you also have a reduction in governance globally when it comes to the major political powers. And sadly, that's not slowing down. And really, the combination of those two factors creates a hot pot for the fallout from the two together. And when you overlay climate change on top of a more difficult political situation, you tend to find in countries and communities around the world that often leads to conflict sooner than might otherwise have been the case. So, yeah, in answer to your question, very difficult to put a time frame on it. I fear we're already in a period where we are mitigating ever worsening effects, and that's going to play out over decades.
Okay, so every reason to act. But your expertise, as you put at the beginning, is really to do with pensions. So some of us, and I include myself in that, of course, are numpties when it comes to matters of finance. So could you explain to me quickly what a pension is, and who in Britain has a pension? I mean, I have one, I know, because mine is through the National Health Service, but most people don't work for the NHS. So who in Britain has pensions, and who are those pensions with, by and large?
So a pension is a tax incentivized method to save for your future. And when I say tax incentivized, to be really clear, if you have a job in the UK today, working for a private or a public company, you will be contributing into your pension gross of tax. So rather than having to pay a contribution to your pension having been taxed, it goes in gross of any tax that you pay through your annual salary. If I think of it another way, I like to think of pensions actually as your ongoing vote for the future. And if I bring that back to, it's often described that when you go to the shops and you buy goods or products, whether you know it or not, you are effectively voting for the world you want to see around you with your wallet. And that has some power to it. With
Yes.
pensions, I feel that the long-term nature of those investments really lends itself to you thinking about the future of the planet and the future of the planet that you want to live in and retire into. And when you are making contributions into your pension during your working life, that is happening every month. So those investments are accumulating over time because they're probably growing in their own right over some medium to long-term periods of time. But equally, every month, let's say when you're paid a salary, that's a further contribution that's being made into your pension. There's a proportion of that that's going into
Okay.
your pension.
So these are tax-free sort of wrappers who are putting our money into. And my National Health Service one, I'm aware it doesn't really exist. It's a sort of promise from the government that I give them some money out of my salary and that they promise they'll give me something back at the end. But for most people in the workplace, they'll have a pension. And where those, what are those investments sitting in? Are they sitting in, perhaps you could tell us differently, things like bonds and equities and so forth? What do they sit in if people are putting their cash into something? What sorts of investments?
It's a really good question. And a lot of assumptions are made within the finance industry that people understand that their pensions are invested into markets in the first place. And that isn't often the case. But yes, the answer is that through your workplace pension, your money that will be used in your retirement is invested into equity and bond markets, and in some cases into more private assets, so perhaps to longer term investments, which might involve infrastructure or real estate, for example. And yes, this is your money that's being invested on your behalf by the pension provider. Now, it's probably worth at this point me giving a little bit of context because this hasn't always been the case. And the regulations that came into effect to allow for these pension investments to be made every month through your employer on your behalf was part of a scheme called auto enrollment that was rolled in to the UK around about 12 years ago. And what we've seen is a lot of the large pension providers have effectively competed on cost in terms of the overall cost that they charge you, the underlying member of that pension scheme. And that's good in a way because certainly we're in a world where you don't want to be ripped off, and the finance industry in the sort of long distant past didn't always have the best reputation in terms of the costs that were charged. So it's good from that perspective. But perhaps it's not so good in terms of the outcome of this race to the bottom, because what we've found when we've done our own research is you tend to find that actually only a very small amount of the fee that you're paying for your pension is allocated to the underlying investments, which are the bread and butter of what you're looking to achieve in the long term. And because it's such a small budget that's allocated to those investments, you are effectively buying a very plain vanilla, low cost investment solution, which, because of its very nature, effectively invests into almost every stock and bond on the planet. So regardless of your values and perhaps even your own budget for things in life generally, what we find is this is a very homogenous industry where if you don't do anything, then you're invested into your workplace's default solution. And I can assure you that is horribly damaging for the planet because you will be invested into all the large oil and gas companies. You'll be invested into tobacco companies. You'll be invested into companies that are associated with deforestation. So it's a one-stop solution to a great extent. And this is deeply damaging. And I think it's only really now that society in the UK is beginning to sort of wake up to this fact and start to consider that being a problem.
Well, I mean, this is an issue, right? Because there are, I mean, probably a lot of people listening to this podcast do care greatly where they spend their money. And there are, shops and brands, shops where they won't shop, brands which they won't buy. But for whatever reason, it might be a political one or some sort of moral and ethical code. And yet when it comes to a pension, what you're suggesting here is that people are saying, well, I've no idea. I could be supporting all sorts of things that I find utterly abhorrent, that I would never support in my day-to-day life.
That's completely true, Hugh. And the pension industry, to a great extent, is purposefully opaque. It's very difficult if you are a workplace pension holder and you want to find out a little bit more about the actual underlying investments that are made within your pension. There are quite a few layers that you have to go through. It's improved somewhat over the past decade, but it's a long way from being as clear as it should be. And this is often the difficulty because I guess people who are curious, who would want to look at this, would spend a little bit of time having a little hunt around and trying to figure things out. And they might see labels for products that they're invested in, and perhaps that label sort of says ESG or sustainable or something along those lines. And they feel comforted that they might not be the worst offender in terms of their underlying pension portfolio. But there's a lot that hides beneath that layer, which clearly lots of people aren't and don't have the time to spend looking into. And it's really there that we feel that there's a great opportunity to raise awareness, to educate, and then to engage.
Right. So, I mean, let's try and put some numbers on this, because there are lots of things that people here would not wish to finance, but we're particularly focused on this podcast on trying to decarbonize. So I do not want to hold any investments in fossil fuel extracting companies or those who would use it as a primary source of income. So I make every effort not to do that. In other podcasts, we've talked about moving your bank account to someone like the Cooperative or Nationwide or Zero or Triodos, a bank that isn't using my money to invest in fossil fuels. But now we've worked out that I don't really know, in that sort of analogy, what my bank is. I'm going to some front end of a shop and I've got no idea where the cash is. So my carbon footprint, I know based on the calculators roughly what mine is, and I've driven it down as far as I can. It's probably somewhere around 3 to 4 tons a year of carbon emitted. And I guess a national average from day-to-day living outside money will be somewhere around 6 to 8. But that's good. We all try and drive it down from our 6 to 8. But what's happening with the money in my investments then? How much carbon emission, what's my carbon footprint of a pension if I'm not taking any active steps?
Yeah, so I mean, I take my hat off to you immediately, Hugh, because driving your carbon footprint in your day-to-day life down to 3 or 4 tons is a fantastic step. And what we tend to find, as you say, is within people's day-to-day lives, on average, the average citizen in the UK is probably driving around about 8 tons of carbon per annum. That excludes their investments and their savings, as you rightly mentioned. Now, when we look at their investments in their pension alone, so this is outside of any ISA investments or anything else that they might have been able to save and invest into, on average, the UK pension size is £30,000. And as I've mentioned, that £30,000, unless you've taken proactive action, is very likely to sit in a default pension scheme that, as we've discussed, is horribly polluting. And this is where the numbers get quite frightening. Make My Money Matter, who I know you had Tony Burnham on a previous podcast in a series. They did a lot of really interesting research a couple of years ago, and they showed that £30,000 investment into a default scheme is supporting 28 tons of carbon emissions per annum. So again, when you compare and contrast that to your day-to-day emissions, it's very significant indeed.
Well, it's 3.5 times as much, isn't it?
Absolutely. What was interesting related to that research, Make My Money Matter came up with this tagline that a lot of people have used ever since, which was changing your pension from a sort of a default polluting option to a sustainable option is 21 times more powerful than a combination of hedging your energy provider, going vegan, and cutting down on any sort of air travel. And that's where that number's coming from. It's just this huge impact that your savings are having year in, year out when it comes
I
to.
mean, it's really big stuff, isn't it? Because we're trying to find in this podcast, find solutions for people where rather than just feeling guilty or frightened, they can alleviate their guilt by doing the right thing and get less frightened because they know that they've done something and can encourage people to do the same. So I agree. Chiseling away at your carbon footprint is difficult. You can stop the flying. You can change your diet to largely plant-based. You can turn your radiators down. You can move to 100% renewable power supply. And actually, those are relatively easy and they all matter. But my word, moving your pension sounds like something that would really make a difference. But how do we go about this? Let's imagine I'm working for, the Nick Stoop Corporation, and the Nick Stoop Corporation say, yeah, we've got this, business pension. Do you want to contribute? And I go, that's fine. And I now want to find out where it's going. How do I go about finding out?
So your first step, and I'll roll this out in terms of the potential sort of impacts and positivity that come off the back of this. I'd say the first step is to understand, if you don't understand already, who your workplace pension provider is, and once you know who that is, what scope there might be within that workplace pension solution to invest in a more sustainable manner. And the people to speak to internally would likely be a combination of your head of HR or head of people, perhaps the head of sustainability, if that sits within your organization, or your chief financial officer. It most likely one of those three people will have the answer for you. Now, one step you can take is to decide that you want to opt out of the default scheme with your workplace pension provider and opt into a more ethical or sustainable investment solution from the same workplace pension provider. And that's definitely a positive step to take. But in reality, the potential for broader impact is limited to just you doing that within your firm. Where we feel there's much greater opportunity, and perhaps this also takes some of that implied pressure that's put on the individual citizen in society today, is to engage with your workplace pension provider to say, well, couldn't we as a business do better than this? Are there workplace pension providers out there that can provide us with a
Mm,
much more sustainable default solution? Because
mm,
the interesting stat that comes out of this is even when people are informed, that leap to opt out of a default and into a different solution, and this will no doubt be a sort of a behavioral science element
yeah,
as well. Very few people do that. Nest, who are the biggest provider of workplace pensions today in the UK, 98.5% of their members remain in the
mm,
default. So it's tiny,
right.
that the number of people that actually make use of this flexibility.
Mm. Well, I mean, I can see. I mean, I'm scared of money. I don't have much of it, but I'm scared of it. I don't like making financial decisions. I find them really scary. It's a bit like asking me to do something with piping or wiring at home. I would rather pay a professional. In this case, you can't really pay your professional directly, as you say. So I could see that getting the person to shift the pension is good. But presumably, one of the first steps to do is to find out whether you can get a gang at work who will join you. Because if you're just the person out of a workforce of 1,000 who's asking for it, or even a workforce of 20, the answer may be clear off, we've made a decision. But if you've got a gang of you going, come on, this isn't any good. So maybe first thing to do, would you say, is find out if there are others who think like you?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic first step. And so rather than that sort of whistleblower mentality, I think of this more of a sort of a pensions flag bearer mentality. And
Yeah.
I think this is a great conversation to be having with colleagues internally. You will find, even if you work for perhaps the most values driven organization, you will most likely find that your pension is letting you down and letting your business and your fellow colleagues down in
Mm,
the way that I've described. And so there
yeah.
really are no stupid questions here, and just getting that sort of engagement going internally, it can be hugely empowering.
Well, I mean, and this is an important thing too, because as I'm thinking about it, talking with you now, of course, one of the arguments against moving is for people to say, well, look, I'm told my pension fund's doing okay. I'm actually really frightened that in 15 years or 5 years or 25 years, I'm going to retire and I'm going to need that money. And actually, I don't really give a monkey's of it in oil because I just need to make sure I'm okay. But of course, in this podcast before, we've talked to economists and others who are telling us that if we continue to drive climate change in the way that we are, there won't be any pensions. These will be stranded assets, firstly, because oil and coal and gas won't be worth anything. But secondly, we've destroyed the economy to such an extent where that money that you thought was a pension won't be valuable. So, I mean, for two good reasons to move, stop the destruction and keep the money in a way that means it's actually valuable to you. Okay, so let's say I've gone and I've checked and I've gone, I really don't like this pension. And I'd really like you to find an alternative. And my HR director says, well, I'm not doing that. Sorry, if you don't like it, you can opt out and you can move your money to Pangea, let's say, move it to you. Is that as horrible a thing as it sounds? Because we're often told by people, oh, I couldn't move my bank account. It's all too difficult. And you say, well, it really isn't. You just seriously, honestly, it takes you 20 minutes. Is it hard for me to come and find a Pangea and then just say, I'd like my money moved from where it is now to Nick's outfit? How do I go about that?
So in the vast majority of cases, it's very simple these days to transfer your pension across, and that's as a result of the industry realizing that this shouldn't be the same huddle that it's been in the past. And so
Mhm.
there's a system which, as long as your pension scheme is a member of that system, and I'd say probably 75% of them are today, then this can all be done electronically, similar to how you'd move your bank account. All it would therefore require, and this is the bread and butter of a lot of the business Pangea has done to
Mm.
date, is where people have come to this realization and wanted to make that change, we take their personal details, we understand their unique identifier with their existing workplace scheme. And once we've got that information, we get in touch with that scheme and we do all the work from that point onwards. And some
Mm.
schemes will turn that round within a week. Others might
Mm.
take a month. There isn't a regulatory sort of hardwired deadline when they have to respond and transfer, but we're encouraged to see that more and more are doing so in a much more amenable manner.
So actually, here we go. We're working out that most people have a pension. Most pensions are actually in these vanilla envelopes, which are just investing in bad things that many of us would not want to be invested in. We found out that we can find out by asking HR director or a finance director. We found out that if it's in the bad stuff, we can ask them to move. We club together. And if they won't, that it's actually not that hard to make the change. And in so doing, we can reduce our carbon footprint from 28 tons a year from those investments. If I move it to a company or investment vehicle that doesn't invest in bad things like fossil fuels, have I got other options? Explain to me what impact investing is, because that's something different, isn't it, from just avoiding the baddies?
Yes, and I remember a similar example given in the banking world where, again, I think it was Tony Burden on your podcast was saying that he banked with Triodos and with the cooperative bank. And he mentioned the Triodos are looking to do things that are positive. So in the investment world, there are really sort of two ways at a very high level of investing in a sustainable manner.
Mm.
One,
Mm.
which has been sort of the most traditional approach, is let's strip out all the bad stuff. So let's get rid of the fossil fuel companies, get rid of the tobacco companies. So you're stripping out underlying investments that would otherwise be made. And that's
Mm.
again is a good starting point, but it's still a long way from really looking to sort of vote for a planet that you would really wish to live in the future. And
Mm.
the corollary to that is there was an increase in interest around this concept of positive impact investing, which is rather than stripping away and applying a negative screen to the investment world, it's saying, well, hey, let's look for businesses that are providing solutions to the environmental crisis, to the social inequality crisis. These are all for-profit businesses, but let's only invest in those positive businesses. And that's the concept of
Mm.
positive impact investing. And it's a similar screen that the likes of a Triodos bank would use when making loans to underlying
Mm.
businesses. They're looking for those positive providers.
And I have to say that, I mean, I sit on a few charity boards, and it's been interesting when we moved out of fossil fuels, and some of those have also moved into impact investing. In general, actually, in the last few years, we've really not done any worse than the general market has. And in fact, in one particular charity, I mean, the fund has beaten the average and it's actually done better than most of the higher performing. So it doesn't have to be that way. I suppose I would always say, and we did discuss this at this previous charity board last week, that the world is changing economically and that fund may do less well than if we were invested in a Russian oil or something else in the years to come. But at least we're still getting a return. It's still a healthy return and it's still the right thing to do, isn't it? So I guess we would all encourage people to follow their consciences as well as their pockets.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that as well, Hugh, that 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, this was seen as very novel within the investment
Mm.
world. There weren't many solutions that were doing this, but financial markets moved pretty quickly, and we now can point towards strategies, both sustainably managed strategies and positively impactfully managed strategies that have stood the test of various market cycles over the past 15, 20 years. And I've been looking just recently out of interest for a solution that Pangea is building for the workplace pension market,
Mm.
where you still are very heavily constrained by costs. And there is an indices that's been created called Paris Aligned Benchmarks, created by MSCI, who are a big indice provider. And they provide a chart of what the performance of that index would look like. And it's stripping about 50% of emissions versus a much more traditional index of underlying securities in terms of the underlying investments that are made. And the performance of that benchmark is very much in line with a traditional sort of
Mm.
world market. So I think there are two things here that are really powerful, again, when it comes to investments and to pensions. One is
Mm,
that you don't expect there to be significant underperformance because you're investing in a way that's good for the planet. That might happen in short periods, but again, when you're thinking about your pension and the long-term investments, that's not likely to be the case over the long term. And the second
mm,
piece is often in your day-to-day life when you're looking to make positive steps when it comes to perhaps your transport or renewable energy, you've always felt you've had to pay a premium for that. And so there's perhaps
mm.
been a cohort of people that are happy to pay that and a much larger cohort that aren't. Increasingly in the investment world, you're not having to pay a premium. So I feel
Right.
that there are two very sort of compelling factors there. And yeah, if we're right that as the green economy accelerates, and we've seen some evidence to that effect, even in the UK over the past 12 months, if this
Mm,
continues despite sort of geopolitical headwinds, and there's every reason to think that it will, then a lot of
mm.
these businesses are going to really benefit from that high growth rate within that sector.
Right. So I'm going to crawl things to a close as we approach 30 minutes of the podcast. So we've learned that our carbon footprint from and our sort of lives otherwise around 8 tons. We could be doing 28 tons from our pensions, that most pensions are, that we can find out if we ask people at work. We can constructively deal with our company and ask them if we can move the entire thing for the whole company. And if people won't do that, we can move easily our pension, to providers that do the right thing by our own moral consciences without necessarily paying any particular premium for doing that. For clarity, I don't have any shares in your company. I'm not being paid by you. I'm not getting a commission. I'm not going to have any of those things. We are clean, but you are one of the good people. I'm not a financial advisor and I'm not offering advice. But if people wanted to contact Pangea to find out what you had on offer, to talk through their pension with you, how do they go about doing that, Nick?
Thank you, Hugh, and they'd be very welcome to. So you could either get in touch with me on email. My email address is nick@pangea.earth. Or alternatively, I'm pretty active on the LinkedIn platform. So by all means, feel free to connect on there and be delighted to have any form of conversation. And like I say, there are no stupid questions when it comes to the pensions world because none of us are taught this at school.
Yeah, so that's Pangea, Pangea. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I would say before I met Nick to talk about these things, I did find these things very difficult. And when you do talk to providers or people who help you out, some providers can be very difficult for you to unpick. It took me a long time to get one group I was talking to last year to actually unpack the fact that they were investing heavily in the major high street banks that were investing in fossil fuel extraction. And I had to say, look, that's not on for me. It has to be out. I think they won't have that problem with you because this is your core business, right? So this is a much simpler conversation, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and it's such a good point you raise because you see more and more people very happily telling you that they've moved bank from a traditional high street bank that's horribly polluting to perhaps a cooperative or Triodos or any of the other banks that are much more ethically aligned. And then they say something along the lines, and they're doing something similar with their pension. And I always sort of ask for a bit more detail there where they're happy to share it because often you find there's a lot of these sort of light touch moves into sort of vaguely sustainable investments will still invest into those banks, still invest into the insurance companies that effectively give these fossil fuel companies and other bad performers a license to do business. And so there is always more to it, but this is something that can easily be achieved. And it's just about asking those questions and having those conversations.
Well, to quote our good friend from previous podcasts, let's make our money matter. Nick Stoop, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you. I've learned a great deal. I hope everyone else has. But now rather than just talking, let's take the actions, find out where our pensions lie, see if they're with the baddies, and move them to the goodies. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant, produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.